나 저기 동화세야 되게 나라 디기세야 가르네 다 뒤지기 취해가데 지나 유단 견지라 때네 중앙마다 유단 견 가라에 맞대봐 중앙세요 말해서 유단 견에 되는 거래셔. 근데 자당한 저기 디기다 땡기 대화 두개야 다 디기디 유단 견에 되는 연구에 봐서 다 디기디 영야래야 디기 영야게 유단 견디 가르가르에서 나가서 하고 뭐신 같이 대한 저기 냠는 직배주 제신 냠는 제바이나 안에 디기디 땡이 디기디 쭉 두야지. 나 동화 영화디게 규단 견라 때는 연구여 봐서 동화디 매봐서 오래 안에 동화 영화에 규디 가르샤 견 가를 때는 연구도 디야 뭐 제바지 영화신과 제제 din 동화 영화에 규단 견디 매봐서 봐이나 가샤바이나 din 동화 영화에 말해서 딘에 자당한 저기 동화 영화에 다 디기 영화에 또 디기 세대 가서래 자와요 되게 지래 제가 동화 세대 가서다 자와요 되게 지금 샘규리 거래 제가 되네자 디기 영화의 견디 가wan디였네 칠로기 술라서 받아 되는게 토안에 견지네 가서 디기 중세요 되스 용통 거래 안에 동화 영화의 칠로기 안에 수자를 지 라서 받을 때네 아주 동화 영화의 견 견지거래서 다 디나신다 조 동아여야 디기야 조디 가르쳐주는 아주 샘기 토네 용거래 샘기 삼다나기 토네 안에 디 토네 샘기 겐제 발라 때네 디기 두고래 해서지 다 디고 쉬고를 받아서는
Good evening. All of us want to experience only happiness and to be freed from all forms of suffering and pain. Happiness, suffering, and in fact all impermanent phenomena that we encounter arise in a similar manner, in dependence on causes. When we understand that happiness that we desire comes from causes, we'll want to identify what those causes are. Because having identified well the causes, we can strive to accumulate those causes and thereby experience ever more desired happiness and mental peace. In particular, a state of lasting happiness where the mind stays peaceful and never experiences any pain or difficulty. So these causes need to be identified so that we can cultivate them. And similarly, suffering, all pain, discontent and misery that we've experienced, this too comes about in dependence on causes. Recognizing that, we'll want to identify what those causes are so that we can be sure to avoid them and avoid them completely, and any such causes we may have on our continuum, eradicate them entirely so as to be freed of suffering, freed of pain. So all of us want to experience only happiness and suffering, and we have a tremendous amount of experience of experiencing wanted happiness and unwanted suffering. And this, as mentioned, all comes about in dependence on causes, and the general source of those causes are in two directions. The one is external, so the objects of our sense pleasures, things we see, hear, etc. Seeing something or tasting something that we enjoy, happiness is experienced. So too with hearing something pleasant. Similarly, hearing something unpleasant, tasting something unpleasant, seeing something unpleasant, suffering arises. That's the one source, from external objects. The other source is internal, other consciousnesses. So for example, dependence on recollecting something. So that recollection is a consciousness, and in dependence on that, happiness or suffering can arise. So there are these two sources of our happiness and suffering, external, relating to the sense objects, and internal, to our consciousnesses. And where we experience happiness and suffering, that too is internal, it's a consciousness.
치료유 원에 당한적이 동아야디 유디메바 베네 남시 장모로시나 남시 장모디 견쟁아줄야 나 캬비 동아 영화 지원거로와 다디 ka mewa sola nga lulia dunga yuan mewa sola ta nimshi jangmo dele pa tuye che sa chil jowe na ko yu na pa pang ka je che ta rang bu zhuo xia wei na ane san ane yang zhami dunga de pa yuan me ka go re ane ine ta yang jian xian yi zhen yang dunga ji cao qin bo na di dunga lian go ro ce yu yong ne dunga yuan de qi ru yong de dunga yuan de negap ngo zo ga tu go de da dian yi zao ge ni me ba sui tu de ga le ka wa che go re ben ne nem shi gyu do xia da de ne ge tuan ne dang an zhe ge ji zan negap lang an zhe ge zhang mo yue na zhang yu dunga yuan ne en cai wei ge zhe da jie zhang mo me ba sui da yang zhe cao qin bei dunga yuan bei ne di me ba sui yang ji zhang mo da jie ne si yu di ki tu ya ge di negap sui tu go de ne dian yi zao ge ni me sui tu ya qi me yao ma le da 다 셈비 나리다 다디면나 다 셈낭파 나도 삼로 나파 삼 뒤화다 저 검제 뇨모베 릭티파지 파가 아니 지기 셈 게위리야 공부도 따바이나 디니 디토네 나도 셈비 둥아디야 자오기네 메바스 투고래 아니 치료기 토네 둥아야데 치치 유기 견제네 먼저 둥아야디야 자오니 메바스 투고래 지사다 먼저 조 가르스네 동화여대 조어디 가르치는 조 심미된의 연구여바디 디가 하고 두고 그래. 조 치료기 유기 뜻기 내갑때 연구할 때 있는 조 심미된 연구여바디. 조 치료기 되는 연구여바는 치료 유지 가투고나 심미 동화 매바서 두고로 하디 두고면도 하지. 지사다 조 심기 코네 줍제 심기 디기 줍 심기 토네 강아 야 유디 파매바서 바이나 낭 심기 동화여대 매바 치료의 견진의 동화야 매바 찾을 수 두고 그랬어. 진짜 낭셈다 치료인이 나네 조셈데 셈레된 연구를 동화야다 디기줘야 셈레된 주고 그랬어. 진짜 되네자 셈레된 주고 그자 다 개체에 대해서 삼례하는 셈미나로 파 아니 가르가르 연구도 제바체 심주체 아니 교화다디 아니 개체물 해서 되가지다 만족이 다 낭비 쇼날마 셰데 셈기 다지게 가르소래 천직세나래 셈규 조탕 셈규 토니 땡진 저와 중화 땡제 디간의 중국에 니 남샤디바 다른 만족이 낭비全나는 조어디 숨고르다.
As I mentioned in that previous segment, the sources of our happiness and suffering are in general twofold, those being external, the objects of our senses, and those being internal, other consciousnesses. And from these two sources arise the consciousnesses of pleasure or pain, misery, of suffering. So if we take an illustration of an external source that's rather relevant right now, the weather is rather cold at the moment. So that is an external source that leads to an internal feeling, a consciousness arising of suffering or unpleasantness because of the unwanted external object, this intense cold. But this external object can be changed. We know with the passing of seasons, the current temperature will change and it will warm up. So opposing conditions will come about in the natural environment, and we'll move from winter into spring and summer. And in this way, the external source naturally changes. But then, we also know, in the height of summer, it's a little too hot. And then suffering, once again, is experienced. So what we see here, and this is a simple illustration, but with the sources of suffering that are external to oneself, there is something that we generally can do, either a natural example, something will naturally, it will naturally change, or we can take action. And in this way, we can dissipate or even bring an end to external sources of suffering. But to bring an end entirely to external sources that lead to suffering arising, this is not possible. This is not possible. No matter how we try and change our world, no matter even though that for many centuries, the greatest minds in the world have been trying to improve technology and change the external environment, and whilst this has helped to dissipate suffering, it cannot eradicate suffering. So that's in relation to the one source of suffering, external. Then how we experience that external suffering, this is of course mental. A suffering feeling tone arises. But also, this is often accompanied by various afflicted minds. Perhaps if it's a person that we're in conflict with, a mind of conflict will arise, as well as the suffering feeling. So the suffering feeling is often accompanied by other minds. And it's these various mental consciousnesses that either we experience suffering by or enhance, add to our suffering. There's afflictions that add to our suffering. So whilst through completely changing our external environment, suffering cannot be eradicated. If we focus on our internal experience, the arisal of the afflictions and so forth, these we can completely transform. These we can completely transform so that we never experience suffering again. And what that would mean is the external world would be left untouched. The same things that previously had led to minds of suffering arising within us, we can still encounter them, but we will not experience suffering because we have completely transformed our mind so that suffering doesn't arise, so that accompanying afflictions do not arise. In the general world, in the fields of science and technology, the focus is on transforming the external world. There is it's certainly in the field of psychology, the emphasis there is on the internal world. But in Buddhism, their emphasis is primarily on the mind, because it's recognized that through transforming the mind, one can gain freedom from suffering, no matter what one encounters. And here in particular in Buddhism, the presentation on dependence arising is utilized to transform the mind.
Dine enza da nga zugi sem nanglo pa jeba chedu kapla nga zu sem lia sem notru gyu cho ma xingbo yu yungwe nisu ma xingbo sem notru gyu bene dua cha hongzho nga ya xia dang tie sum xia dang lo xie xia de desu cha zang sem notru ma notru xie ane ka su yu yungwe nisu ma tongwa ming li ma song de longwa ru yang yang xia de cha zang desu gi che su zhawa na nga zu lia 가령 것은 누가 용거래 대수기 때에 동아 용거 제부 동아 용거래 해야지 나 대수기 매워서요 랑의 니수고 지미 지진 하고 유기 니수 셰비게 참마디 로너트 유디 또베게 참마디다 로너트 많이 받지 너트 매받지 참마디 제가 로 참마디기 제수라 봐이나 나zul야 동아 용 말했어 제가 가르선에 로 너트 요 매받자그로 로 너트 매나 동아야 규디 매바 차고 제가데 로 체마데리 지수장도 그래 체마디 여바이나 안딩아 저기 가서 디기 주비야 디줍도 그래 해서지 중国지상한 저 롤파 야도에 켜바체 지단 디 나줄래 방고에 로디 매바서가 디리 규유한 로 디술 디 매바서 그래 지단다 로 규매간 체마딩아 저 냠술린 거디야 곰체네 뉴슈처 땅 그래 해서지 어두시는 안 저기 슈거와
There are many ways to divide minds. One way is into those which are erroneous and those which are non-erroneous. The erroneous minds or mistaken minds, that entire class, is in brief those which are not in accordance with reality. And these encompass the afflictions. So these are minds that do not know the actual situation of how things exist and even alter or act in a way that's contrary to the way things exist. And so whilst we may think we are acting with wisdom, with intelligence, very often the minds that we are utilizing have varying degrees of error. When we come to recognize this, we actually come to realize that through lifetime to lifetime, we have been not only bound in cyclic existence, but we've been blind to the causes of our suffering. The contrary class of minds are those which are non-erroneous or unmistaken, and these then are valid cognizers. This class of mind are free of faults, they're always free of faults. So understanding the difference, these two classes of minds, it's clear that if we are blind to reality, we are going to continue to suffer. We're going to continue to accumulate the causes that will lead to suffering, and the quality of the causes for happiness will be limited, will be weak. Whereas on the other hand, the stronger our valid cognizers are, the more in accordance with reality we will act, and therefore we come to recognize that we must develop valid cognizers. And the method for doing so is through gathering knowledge, through study, receiving teachings, and meditating repeatedly over a sustained period on those teachings, habituating our way of thinking to non-erroneous minds, and in this way, slowly developing the quality of our consciousnesses and eventually developing ever more valid cognizers.
Jamba, Shanla, Zevi, Samba Chambadi, Nuchi, Sulnigo, Shanla, Condosavio, Sambati, Nugores. Stand this all natural Nuchires, Doshores. The names are Nuji, Lodi, Mazuya, Yamnija, more complete Tabena, Deepa, Doshodiba, Ranshima, Shuchun Shugures, Chesan Kizima, Naja Nuji, Movichir, and deep down Puljung. Temba kun said, Kizin Namja Zaviki Shuntina Sonsoa, Chesa Diva, Dan Puljung said, Tomba in Tobe, Lauda, Lotema Rikti, Yane and Gomba, Nubish should Tamji Kimbi go watch Pudu Juma Charogres. Desoma Nuba Gombe the Dode, Di Dosho Lo Shiba Dikisa, Ma Dip to Wars. Chesa Dinenza, Lo Shedan, Lo Notu, Cha Kondo, Naya. Nyomoba, Tesumza, Shasam Mevas, 2 years, 2 good aggressors, digging Nyembo, and the Doksho, Zinanga, Lord Yorvas, the company Mevas, 2 good years, Kizin Yamanga, Yamatele, the negotiator, Nature, which Tibetan Pulchin Temple, meeting Chotani, Chin, the company, Dapa, used the combine, and Tiba, Sabana, Java, Bunch, Tarpatum Chikibo, 2 good years, Shasam and Lolpa, no true down, Lord Sema Yawache. She's not that Lord no true my Sema to Gomba, Latine, Yane and Gomba in the Nubo Compete Church Charwood. Nubo wanted Lord no true Ritima, Rashi Marchin and Sabana Java, Gilligan Bangwood. Yes, she's not the Bangro Diana, Bangbe Bangba tops on it, then it dingy Dewa Tobare, then it dingy Dunga, Tarsare, Dunga, Yomare, or what. Lala Sahwa Saber, Gurson, Sahwa Yomoba Chasan Bang Chen, Tarbio Toguri, as a kissing and Digo Shiver.
Last time we concluded with looking at 2 quotations from Paranavatika in our text at the top of page 23. So the first quotation, an ascertaining mind and a falsely superimposing mind are entities of refuter and that which is to be refuted. So here we're looking at these 2 classes of minds. The one that is on the side of valid cognition, which is the refuter, and the other that is on the side of erroneous minds, those which are to be refuted. So there are a vast array of minds that can be looked at that are contrary. For example, to the extent that anger arises, love is suppressed. Because anger refutes or eradicates, a synonym would be eradicates, the eradicated would be love. On the other side, though, ignorance. Ignorance, when it is eradicated or refuted, its refuter, its eradicator, is wisdom. And the key point being made here is contrary minds cannot exist together. To the extent that one is habituated to the one, our habituation to the other weakens. And then we looked at the second verse. All decrease and increase dependently, just due to being together with incompatible factors. From familiarity with that antidote, self-grasping is transformed. As a consequence, finally, the contaminations are removed. This then makes the point that, if we think of the old-fashioned scale, as one side is heavier, the other side gets overwhelmed. But this isn't fixed. We can add more weight to one side and change the equation. So right now, our habituation to afflicted minds means that that side of the scale is weighty, and therefore our virtuous minds are often overwhelmed. And this is experienced as an habituation to unwholesome ways of thinking, and that it results in unwholesome ways of speaking and acting. But through repeatedly, over a sustained period, receiving teachings and meditating on those teachings, we start to recognize the faulty ways of thinking as such, and understand the wholesome ways of thinking, and strengthen our habituation to them. And in this process, especially if we engage in receiving teachings and reflecting on them repeatedly over a sustained period, the scale starts to move. And here, we start to strengthen our wholesome minds, eventually leading them to become valid cognizers. And as we're strengthening our wholesome minds, the unwholesome minds are being refuted or eradicated, which means they'll arise within us with less frequency, and when they do arise, they'll have less strength and less duration because of the strength of our wholesome minds. And as we continue with this process, we'll be able to eventually eradicate completely our unwholesome minds through severing them at their root by removing the ignorance that misunderstands reality. And then we see in the fourth line, as a consequence, finally, the contaminations are removed. So here, they've been removed completely, and one attains freedom. And freedom, from the Buddhist context, doesn't mean freedom of movement and speech. It means freedom from contaminated minds. It means freedom of erroneous ways of thinking. It means a mind that is pure from any contamination at all.
어디는 자다디 저기 독서 체매로디 양념는 식으로 해서 어디 그생 티슈에 안다디 나신다 시송바다 러스티니마 안에 좀 지금 마숨 걸어 진당 뭐가도 송비 르니스 나제 니지도 조회사 디강기디 돈다 마시고로다 지나 진담변에 진당 뭐가도 소화생아도 동바인다 동이도 불러다 딘지를 잡아나 변에 가사 템버투버즈 가사 템버투버즈가 딘지세야디기 믹스에디 가로 믹스에 가사를 미고래 미진에 가사디 라신 주버진디오래 갈라이마도 랑고 뭐에 주버진디오래 다 동반이 또 별로디기 당보 믹스에디 가사 미지 가사디 갈라이마도 랑고네 주비 동바진디오래 제자도 공이 독서 다다차대로 봐 지기 가사의 라신 주버진바래 딘진디기 다 가사 동반이 또 별로디기 가사의 라신 마주버 또디고래 라신 마주버 진디고 제가 혼이 진당원거 소화래서 다 진당원거 소화자 내제뇌제 차고래서 찍찍찍 뇌사디제 찍 뇌지들이서 제가 다 딘진내가 저 공부이나 동이도 별로디原来 매화수도야 말다 딘진디기 동미도 별로 매화수도고 말 딘진의 뇌제 차고 말 딘진디 딘진디기 동이도 별로 매화수도고를 배선 수도고 말해 제가 딘진디 동이도 별로 뇌제 말해 그 뇌캔데 말해 뇌두고 말해 동이도 별로 뇌두고 말해 다 Tenzin Kora Nurse Derida, Sunu Gorsne, Tony Gansa, Demba Tuba, Demma Maduba Tope, Tony to Lodigi, Tenzin de New Gores. Ganes New Gorsen, Tony to Bolodicaze, Shucher combine Denzin Ma Shuchun, not to war, Mavas to war. Cesa, Nation du Shire, Joy, Cesa, Tanga, Daddy, Zendang Wongo, Yu Be, and Luni, Nation Song, Sedanga, Loten Shabena, Gansa, Demba to be Tenzin Deta. Gansa temba majubo tobe tongi tobe gansa temba majubo tobe loni bodi ne zindang wongo so loni res kunyi na jen de res sesa na jen de joye sa di so da zindang wongo de so bi loni na jen de so res sesa kunyi zindang wonga de mo so gawa de res mo so gawa en na jen de res.
Now let's continue in the text where we come to His Holiness's commentary on those two verses. So just as the translator, I've made a couple of changes to this first sentence. It's the only changes we'll have this weekend. So to the end of this first sentence, I've changed it a little bit. So we, on page 23, just below the quotation, the first two quotations, a conceiver of inherent existence and a consciousness that has directly contradictory manner of apprehension are respectively awarenesses that are, so I've added that, awarenesses that are, the refuted and refuter. So I've just swapped the order of those last two words so it matches what we have in brackets. But I'll read it again. A conceiver of inherent existence and a consciousness that has a directly contradictory manner of apprehension are respectively awarenesses that are, the refuted and refuter. So what His Holiness is writing here is what we looked at last time, and these two, in terms of the meaning of these two verses above. That if we take two consciousnesses, one of ignorance and one of wisdom, they have the same object, they are observing or focusing on the person. So the observed object or the focal object is the person. The object's the same, object possessor, the consciousness differs. One is in ignorance, the second is wisdom. Ignorance observes the person as existing by way of its own nature. Wisdom also observes the person, but as being empty of existing by way of its own nature. So therefore, the same object, the person, is viewed in contradictory ways, in a contradictory manner, by these two consciousnesses, one of ignorance, one of wisdom. So that then is what we have here, a directly contradicting manner of apprehension, or the way of expression you'll be more familiar with, the mode of apprehension. So the manner of apprehension, the mode of apprehension, or you could also say the manner of grasping. This is directly contradictory. So as was presented in these verses here, these two minds being contradictory, one is going to harm the other, and that other will be the harmed. Or what did we have? We had that one will refute the other, which will be the refuted. So true grasping, the ignorance, grasping at the person as existing by way of its own nature, that cannot harm wisdom. It is contrary to wisdom, but it cannot harm the wisdom. The wisdom, on the other hand, certainly can and does harm and eventually eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping. So here, what we see as refuted and refuter, this refers to a conceiver of inherent existence, so an ignorance that holds or observes its object as existing by way of its own nature, and its directly contradictory manner of apprehension is the refuter, which is a consciousness of wisdom.
동이 제바 지는 된지 여러 봐. 이내 동발에 제바 동이 제바 제래 가투고 말아. 가투민도 와. 다 동방이 또 별로 깨와라야 고 가투민도 와. 가스는 된지 여 나야 두스네 동방이 제바 지네 동방이 또도 또 두고도와 동이도 불로 게 두고래. 그래서 다 동이도 불로 게 사회 제라다 동이도 뭐 된지 그런 동방이 내스 가면 거 매와 차로 와. 간사 데모마도 뭐 동이도 간사 데모 된지니 매와 차로 와. 진짜 간사 데모마도 또 동이는 내 거요 말고 그런 거 매와 차로 와. 그래서 간사 나주길에 간사 데모도 뭐 준비 된지 요르데 이내 간사 데모도 뭐 제바 지디 갑는데 제바 지별로 대한 가투고 말와. 제바 지고래. 제바 지내가 야야 띵띵이 남들 동방이 또 배다 도로 지별로 대한 동이 또 이주리로 대한 가투고 말에 된지니기. 한 동이 또로도 그런 매가 자르고 그런 죄르고 말마서는 그 죄르고 와다 들어와. 지사다 동이 또 별로디기 동이 된지를 누고래. 그래서네 동이 마도 공론에 동이를 제바지야 제바지데 된지 짐바지 짐바 그 짐바는 정말 이내면나 가네나 선비 남성 태좀 계용 거로 지산 파 제바제제 땡땡 남자들 파 동메 떨어지 이주기도 오다 짐바 나신데 다 따라 민두 선비 섬리로 지산다 동방에서 세명해 봐니도 동방이 또 세마 줄기도 오다 대시 자와기네 민두와 선비 동사 좀 또는데 덴바즈비 덴신의 록시원에 노르이 마하고요 그 지산다 동이도 로디기 동 덴신의 뇌사 덴신 이 동이 마도 가는 제 동이를 제바지로 호롱기는 마 콜레트스 스니고로 와다 네투고로 와 계속 되게야다 지지고로 그래서 디네사 동이도 로디기 가사 동이 덴바모도 보도 로디 가사 덴바도 베지미 덴신의 뇌고레 아니 가사 덴바도 베지미 덴신이 가사 동방이 또베 될 기내 네투야 말 뇌 될 뇌야 마세 아니 될 제바지로 네투고 마 가투고 말와.
In the previous segment, I made a statement that the wisdom realizing emptiness it can refute the refuted, being the ignorance of self-grasping. But the ignorance of self-grasping, whilst directly contradictory, or having a directly contradictory manner of apprehension to that wisdom, the ignorance cannot eradicate the wisdom. So just to say it again so it's clear, wisdom can eradicate ignorance, but ignorance, despite being directly contradictory to wisdom, cannot eradicate wisdom. So let me explain why that is the case. The one can eradicate the other, but that other cannot eradicate the second one. And the reason is quite clear to understand in that we all sit here as people who, whilst we're meditating on emptiness, we are yet to realize emptiness. So we are able to meditate on emptiness, cultivate a mind of wisdom that is to some extent in accordance with reality, whilst still having ignorance of self-grasping. So the ignorance of self-grasping that we've had throughout this life and since the beginning of time is not able to eradicate our burgeoning wisdom. We are able to develop wisdom despite the presence of ignorance. So therefore we can see that ignorance cannot eradicate wisdom. But in fact, despite having ignorance, which is has a directly contradictory manner of apprehension to wisdom, we can cultivate wisdom, and that wisdom can grow. And there's a sequence through which our wisdom develops. And throughout this sequence, ignorance remains. So first, we have a doubt tending towards the fact, where we hearing about emptiness, we thinking, reflecting, and we have a doubt thinking, this presentation could be true. We develop this a lot, and we come close to gaining a realization, but this is not a realization yet, it's a correct assumption. So now we have an understanding that is correct, and it's come about in dependence in different ways, but mainly or the best form would be on reasoning. But still, we have ignorance present, because we have not yet developed a realization. This consciousness of wisdom is not sufficiently strong. But through repeatedly, over a sustained period, engaging this meditation based on ever more growing knowledge, we will come to realize emptiness, And then our wisdom will long since have been a Tao tending towards the fact, will now no longer be a correct assumption, but will in fact be a valid cognizer, an inferential valid cognizer. And this is what really harms the ignorance of self-grasping. In particular, when this is developed further to being a direct valid cognizer, then the ignorance, whilst the direct valid cognizer is realizing emptiness, is eradicated. So this is the sequence through which our wisdom is developed, from a Tao tending towards the fact, to the correct assumption, to an inferential valid cognizer, to a direct valid cognizer. Through this sequence, the scale on the side of wisdom is growing in strength, which means our ignorance is still there, but it's being impacted. Eventually, our wisdom will have the strength to do serious harm to that ignorance, and eventually, much further on, will eradicate ignorance in its entirety. But there is this process as we're developing our wisdom that we harm our ignorance. Eventually, we'll eradicate it. But this process doesn't work conversely. If it did, because of our strong habituation to ignorance, we would struggle to even start to meditate on emptiness. But all of you have been doing this for a while, which means you, from your own experience, you know that ignorance cannot overwhelm or eradicate your wisdom.
Jizang koli gyumche karesne temba madubare madubegi tobe chema dile gyabden chema kare yorasne temba madubare karesne temba dubna kanglai matyoba chigungori di shanle tyene chugudu wasbe tenjegi tobe chema digi kasa temba madub tobe chema dile pembe dugore jiza tenjegi tobe de ne tenje de la de gyudan gyela tyoba yanla la tyoba de ne chema mangbo chigi delia gyabden jetugore Kasa temba tuba sebe denzin dela temba tuba rea san zinde ba mado inbigi gyumse tsema jik gyablo yomara je gyabden tsema yomara dinye le ya yorum chigi ma teshe nado kisin teshe nado kabla jesa tongbanyin tobe lo dila gyabden tsema yomara chinchu tobe lo dila gyabden tsema yomara jesa jesa dade kasa temba mo tuba tobe tsema dila gyabden tsema yodan karela na kasa temba tuba tongba rea se 인비 김사가 디잡로로 삼다데 템바 두바이나 강라이 마두바 친구를 제 강사디 규단 제 샹라 뛰는 두고도 와서베 체마지래 디 체마디기 강사 데모모도 또베 체마데 핑거로 와 제가 체마 잡든 체마요래서 제가 디네 인자 코 잡든 체마요 봐서 공업의 공부들 공의니 수도 하고 되로 공의니 수디 삼nu가 찍게 야게 줘야요 공의니 수 많이 받이 봐 심지지도 가서 매봐 차려야마도 아니 야게 줘야 매봐다고 제가 되는 인자 동방이 또 배체마디 아니 제 뇌자디 공부 뇌지 잡든 체마여 봐제 되면 딘진데라 잡든 체마 매바래 사실 도시는 나송거로 봐
Those who have reviewed well last weekend's teachings will recognize that what are presented here, His Holiness presented in the fourth bullet point at the bottom of page 22, which is that the wisdom realizing the emptiness of inherent existence is supported by a valid cognizer. Whereas, in the same paragraph, he also said that the ignorance of true grasping or the ignorance of self-grasping, being a wrong consciousness, can never be supported by a valid cognizer. Therefore, because valid cognizers can be developed, therefore our wisdom, that currently is not supported by a valid cognizer, will eventually be so. And why? Because the wisdom is in accordance with reality. And therefore, as our understanding of reality grows, our consciousness of wisdom, which will initially be a Tao tending towards the fact, and eventually a correct assumption, and then come into a valid cognition, we can see that our wisdom is supported eventually by a valid cognizer through this process of development. Whereas our ignorance that does not understand reality is contrary to reality. This cannot grow. This cannot grow. It cannot develop. Merely, we have our ignorance. But whilst our ignorance can remain unchecked by wisdom, as we develop our wisdom, that ignorance that would otherwise have remained as it is, in terms of its strength, will weaken and eventually be eradicated.
Kansa Timmy Topolo and Tinsin Lichana Shabadisha. That day, Auntie Zindango to so Luni said that Zindango Luni said that Lord Mangurova, Penda de Jing on the Zindango Luni said, Kansa Timber to be Tinsin, Kansa Timmy to Luni Shasherva. That dinner change a magic dinner Pumbo Timber to be Tinsin, Pumbo Timber to be Tamase, the Leisha Shashore. That dinner change on the guitar, Pendekansa, Tapatimbe, Dawson said down. Kansa mitapato be semanibo di tindango lore. Chesnata tindango sokawa karasana jidi kansa di pe gyune jiemi de tiendo neba di tindu gore tapachingeni. Ta kansa mitapato be semade kansa di gyuojugo ba kiji gyuojugo ba tinde tindango ga dada chale. Cheta dine injang da kiji gyuojugo ba mitapato be semadi kansa tapachime tazinde nyugore da nyugore. Chesa Nishis. Chizanda Mitabotobe, Kansa Mitabotobe, Samadi, Yaki, Kansa Tabas Metazin Medu, the Kansa Deshin Shebajivarda, Eli Kansa Tabas Metazin Digi, Kansa Mitabal Chebajibulo, the Yanka to go Mare, Ko Kansa di Pa, Cheba, Kansa di Mitaba Reme, Chebachi, Tapa Reme, Chebachi, the color, Chiku to how would the Tapa in some Mare, some dinner, doesn't the new gore. Da kansa mitapate kansa said kichi mitapa redo wasn't be swimming ever near the kansa tapas in the meadow. Says Kansa mitapa to be sema digi, kansa doesn't never so to go. Kansa tapas with sema de kansa mitapa to be sema never so to go, mother. Chesana genusia. In the dinner, kansa mitapa to be sema de combalatine, kansa tapas metas in the never so to go. Yes, she's not a doctor, Zindangongas, Zindangongas will do his or that one.
There are many consciousnesses that can be given as an illustration that have directly contradictory manner of apprehensions. I mentioned before love and anger, and we've been looking at now the ignorance of self-grasping and the wisdom realizing the emptiness of the self. But we can, last time I also spoke a lot in relation to grasping at permanence, the ignorance grasping at permanence, and then the wisdom realizing subtle impermanence. These two consciousnesses would also apply to being a conceiver of grasping at permanence, an ignorance grasping at permanence, and a consciousness that of wisdom that is a directly contradictory manner of apprehension that would be have a relationship of refuted and refuter, meaning that we currently grasp at the person as well as the aggregates as being unchanging, as being, in other words, permanent, as being unchanging. But when we reflect, do they exist in this way in reality or not? We recognize that the physical as well as the mental aggregates, the person itself, is not the physical and mental aggregates are not permanent. They change momentarily. This way, as we develop this wisdom, despite having an ignorance grasping at the aggregates as being permanent, we can develop this wisdom, realizing subtle impermanence, and eventually eradicate the ignorance that grasps at permanence. So this is two different consciousnesses, but the sequence is the same as before. Because we already have this ignorance of grasping at something as being unchanging, despite it not being so it's an ignorance because it's not in accordance with reality, we can still develop wisdom at the same time. And eventually, through the process or the procedure mentioned earlier, we'll be able to eradicate that ignorance.
jampa 닝제 제와 계셔로와 강사들라 심전들라 미제 파 제와 계셔로와 심전라 미비게 제위 삼바티 디고문나 심제 강사 템버투버 틴신디 총다 투그르베스네 다 투고 말다가 다디 가서 제위 삼바 강사 심제들 제위 삼바 곰네 강사 심제디 템버투버 준비 강사 템버투버 준비 틴시디 마뉴버 출당을 베스네 다 투고 뉴고 말 그래서 거기 진단 가와 말해 그래서 가서 제외 삼바디 대바다 되나 선비기 되어 지게 잠바 삼다이도 동화다 다나 선비기 제와 동화다 다나 삼바리 마도 아니 덴디기 동화다 다나 선비 삼노디기 템버투베 덴질레 뉴고 가라 마토바 라운은 주도바 짐바데레 뉴고 말해 그래서 거기 진단 가와차도록 가와차고 말해 진단 가와만자 동 잠바 공부한다 잠바다 제와다 인지 공부이나 동의도 비게 가서 템버투베 덴질레 뉴고 말해스 제산 딘진 빵투 말해스 잠니제 공부 exam지 근데 딘진 빵투 말해스 제산 딘진 빵발라 딘진다 진다 무소가 해비고로디 공부 그래스 제산 딘진다 딘진다 진다 무소가 불로디 동의도 불로디 마도 챤요 말해 제산 미다바 공부이네 딘진다 진다 무소 걸로 말해 미다바도 불로당 안에제 강사 다음에 라바도 불로시아당 잠바시아당 제스 샤사 만제 딘진다 진다 무소가 불로 책요 말해 제가 진당고서 막아와 인자 아니 계속 가지고 공부해네 딘진 기능 유튜브 말 딘진만에는 딘진 빵투고 말해 제가 디네 인자다 딘진 빵발라 인지 민지 딘진디나 진당고가도 수별로 공부 그래서 제가 진당고서로데 가르스네 동의도 불러드려서 디 공부 그래서 제가 당한 저기 동의세에 맞아 계침뭐 쉬우지 쉬어와도 딘진디래 제가 디 빵발라 동의도 불러도 겁나마도 진당원가 수별로디다 무슨 개별로디 동의도 불러디래 니 덴질을 내셔래 디 공발할 때네 덴질 매봐서 그래서 제가 디네 연사다 동의디 계침뭐 쉬우래 사지디래 당하서
To talk further then about this expression, a directly contradictory manner of apprehension. I've given several illustrations: love and compassion, ignorance of self-grasping, ignorance, the wisdom realizing emptiness, as well as grasping at permanence, the ignorance grasping at permanence, and the wisdom realizing subtle impermanence. But with all of those illustrations, the two differing consciousnesses have an opposing or contradictory manner of apprehension. And it's only through having a contradictory manner of apprehension that the mind that's in accordance with reality can weaken and eventually overwhelm and eradicate the ignorance, or the mind that is not in accordance with reality. So therefore, whilst one should and needs to cultivate love and compassion, no matter the extent that we develop love and compassion for all beings, it will not harm our ignorance of true grasping, because the manner of apprehension of those consciousnesses, love and compassion on the one hand, and the ignorance of true grasping, their manner of apprehension, their mode of apprehension, are not at all contradictory. The minds of love and compassion want all sentient beings to experience only happiness, a happiness freed from all pain and misery. That is the goal of a mind of love and compassion. It's not a mind that is cultivating an understanding of how beings exist in reality, how a consciousness such as love or compassion exists in reality. So therefore, its way of or manner of apprehending its object is not contrary to true grasping. So whilst one needs to develop love and compassion, we cannot eradicate the source of all suffering without developing a consciousness which has a manner of apprehension that is directly contradictory to ignorance's manner of apprehension. So therefore, whilst it's essential to develop love and compassion, it is essential too that we develop the wisdom realizing emptiness, because it, and it alone, the wisdom realizing emptiness alone has a contrary manner of apprehension to the ignorance of self-grasping. And therefore, it's only this consciousness of wisdom that can eradicate ignorance and lead to freedom from suffering. So therefore, this presentation, this text in its entirety, is absolutely crucial for us to understand it well and to integrate it through repeated meditation. Because this is the sole technique to bring an end, a complete end, to suffering.
먼저 별에 다가로 변형하는 저기 집에 차와치 되어버리네 차와디 매봐서야 인지미지 장모지 거르마도 장모지 매나 차와 매봐서 그 말와 변형하는 차와치 되어버리네 차비기 차와디 매봐서야 아니 주 둘로 거바이네 둘로 장모지 매 둘로 지고면은 차와 매봐서 그 말에 아니 저게 간실에 둘로시나라 신노와 주변나 장모여서 거르와 장모주요나 장모디게 차와디 매봐서 거래 제가 인지 미지 차와디 매봐서라 장모지 거르와 제가 디나신 안도 차와 주변나 야디 차와디 매봐서 가야도 날 둘로 공부네 아니 가서네 차와 매봐서 그 말 가서네 둘로디 디나고 차와이는 뭐 가와 뭐수 가와 내지는지 제가 말해 제가 차와디 매봐서 장모 고고래 장모디 매봐서라 차와 고고래 니 차와 차라 차와당 장모니디 자신이 버디 군이 내지는지 지지를 누고래 군이 뒤지려 군이 냠도 투모한테는 되마도가 지리다 제가 내지는지 제가 디네자 인지미티 빼디나 하시리다 내지는지 고고래 내지는지 많이나 먼저 셈긴 니 텔레뇽 뭐 받을 내지는지 많이나 니도 말해야지.
What's presented is perhaps more quite technical, but the thinking behind it is completely in accordance with our own reality. We know that if we're cold, for example, we want warmth, so therefore we need to do something contrary to cold to gain warmth. Or perhaps some of those of you at home watching on YouTube, if your house is too hot, your room is too hot, you need to do something contrary to excess heat so as to cool down. Doing something completely unrelated to that, it's not going to have an impact. So here we see an illustration of, as the text has it, as refuter and refuted, or perhaps in this context we'd say the harmer and the harmed. If we want to harm our cold, we need to use something that will cause it harm, namely warmth. So this is the same thinking as is referred to in His Holiness's commentary.
That's the machine by needing national. Then Kangba swim machine gets your Kangba swim Morata machine watch. Morata machine by the remote Diag, washing in the national generation, remote Yabutishin Bene, Kangba swishing mare. Draw Chizan Kangba swim machine by the Mavas to mare. Chizan Dineza go. 권이论이도 독서 차고 뭔가 책고 말 진단 뭔가 책고 말 제가 강바 수의 마신 비율로디랑 리몬 지시 비율로니도 뭔가 책고 말 제가 리몬 지시 바네 강바 수의 마신 바데 매바 두고 말 진행자 그 나신듯이 책고 말 빼디나 하신다 디송아도 둠디봉아서 세부로지 롤야 차디보로와 제가 시야고 당시에네 야로 잡신 말에 제가 시야고 당 신바디기 독서 가르가서 시에 땅마신 바디 바가고래 가고래 시에 땅마신 바디 니회 나전되시래 제가다 샤브로 잡마신 바디 대당 시에 땅신 바디데 나전되시 말해 제가디 시에 야고 땅신나 샤브로고 잡에 마신 바디 가도고 마 잡신 말와 니변 디송한테 비 아주 통쇼스여 봐 dum디고를 책으로 어디 나신다 미다바 도베 체마다 미다바 따바지면 니들 따선 나전되시래 잠보 공부게 잠지게 삼로대다 딱 받으면 니디 내전내지 말에 인자 잠재 겁나 따스는 이거 말에 잠재 겁나 아니 댄셀은 이거 말에 지산디 곧 내전도 좀 말해야지. 어디 배디나지.
So there are many illustrations that can be given. For example, if someone can't draw well, but would love to draw well, they need to develop the contrary mind. So right now they have an ignorance as to how to draw well, so they need to develop the wisdom, the skill of being able to draw well. And in this way, through developing a contrary manner of apprehending the object that they want to draw, they will be able to become a skilled artist. But if on the other hand, they also want to learn to drive, no matter how many driving lessons they have, the drawing is not going to improve. Even if they become a phenomenal driver, they'll still not be able to draw. Because these two, not being able to drive, not being able to draw, if you develop just the one skill and become a great driver, but it will have no impact on one's inability to draw. They are not contradictory. Similarly, if one can't sing or dance, then by training in singing, one will overcome the ignorance relating to not being able to sing. But it will have no impact on one's inability to dance. That needs to be trained in too. So therefore, just back to our Buddhist context, as much as we develop love and compassion within us, that will have an impact only on the minds, will have an impact on those directly contradictory minds, but it will make no impact on a mind that is not at all contradictory to it, such as the ignorance of true grasping.
Dine当这个제상这嘛这个sem拿了俺说上路点有了的把这个没把需要了呀你不点点过的些的这个啥出去其实点子没把需要了你们把没把需要的잠재 kom다的给话的确认其实确实呢잠재 kom다的确认吧的确认这边呢你们把图是吧上边上当的大切个嘛就是确认这边呢你们把图也给挨吧有嘛的其实今天上你们把没把学把了帮他的点帮过来你不点过来些的本来那是的来面地平的那是的来面地平的些的过面来就这么那是把边面有了吧那都那是觉得面地的面的三不这个是面刚就没啥些吧那是这对有嘛别的那些就你们把帮把了你们把具体没把学过来具体没把学把了具体年报的开始也是呢他做的东北人都不落的公布的第一没把学的公布到俺你们确几个月呢你们把这第一主要的确几个月是咱这样公的把给其他第一的用户的第一呢你们把早晚的帮助嘛的其实定义的话图嘛的其实定义的话图完了可你不点那的好过的你们把看得起来你不看得定过你们把点起来你不看得定过的怕好过这的呢你们家好你们这边呢可那懂得我去呢可帮推啊他那这个也我去我图过的中间的那他这个中间的图过的送过来现在的人家都是呢现在的确现在他们就的确的这些玩你们帮人现在帮推要嘛的
It's good to understand this because one's encouraged to engage in a variety of virtuous activities. And one should do so understanding the result that will follow so that one doesn't end up disappointed that a different result never came about. If one is striving to develop a loving and compassionate outlook, putting great energy into it, seeing it as Dharma practice, this is of course good to do. But to be disappointed that one hasn't eradicated the afflictions from one's mind, well, that would be mistaken, because love and compassion do not have a directly contradictory manner of apprehending its object. Just like, for example, if one is ill, the pharmacy is full of a variety of medications, but one needs the particular medication suited to one's illness, not just any old medication. So wanting to be freed of suffering, what one needs to come to firstly understand is what leads to suffering, namely the afflictions, and that the afflictions themselves come from a cause, ignorance of self-grasping. Understanding the sequence, one will want to eradicate the root, because by cutting the root, we understand that no afflictions will arise and therefore no suffering will be experienced. And we will here, through this presentation, understand that the ignorance of self-grasping can only be eradicated through a consciousness that has a directly contradictory manner of apprehension, namely the wisdom realizing emptiness. Understanding that, then, gives rise to an enthusiasm to train one's mind repeatedly, so that one is no longer overwhelmed by ignorance.
다한테는 녀모가 딜라 녀모 매바술에 녀모 간스 콤을 녀모 데니스 콤보레 데니스 삼당을 데니스 제바제거스 발 지게 차상하지 발 녀모가 오트체 녀모가 딜라 녀모디게 오트체 되네 곰나디 용오트체 발 지디 담보디 퇴고로와 퇴로와 다 퇴네는 아주 녀모베 딜야 야네 야도 삼다지 녀모베데 야볼로 방외선 와제 안 딜레 녀모 코미아데 녀모데 데니시 콤고거스베 야네 야도 삼다도 안 삼바샤고 제사다 데니기 녀모 야네 야도 삼다자 하고 녀모 디레샤세베 네 소소기 땡케바쇼도 데네고 콤자야다 띵이진 죽제 신이요다 제지도 콤제 뭐 콤페다제 데네고 콤야죠 제사 퇴섬 콤숨세야데 안지게 계셔뭐 다딩가 당보 마텨바이나 퇴 지기로 베네가지 멤버자 지바로와 멤버 자도가라 나지 데니시는 맨 데니스 제고래 나지 데니시는 맨 파지 나지를 못해체 디네 나지 델 바베게 맨 디디디디 제고래 세게 못해체 이제 제사 장차네 당보 안에 멤버 자도가라 기현전에 고고 퇴고로 나지 데니디 디나지 데니시요래 디나지 데니용을 해서 나지 디 용다데 못해체 다 나지 데니시나 맨 디테고래 나지 데니시나 맨 디테고래 파 라트전 디테바지 지바라와 나 삼바치 삼시도 소소나 오다 바뎁주 로징 해바시야와 오 나지 데니시용고 데니시용고 데르만 데니스티고르다 데니스티고르서 소수게다 해바지네 안에 소소야 템부스야 들어와 템부스야 차네 안제만 멤버 차에도 나질레도 맨 디다다다다 제신다 세고르와 온 디나시 아주 당보디 디 나세다 게 셈게 로셰도 로 마룬와 릭티 녀모버디 모트바체 데 디디네 요아서 퇴 델레님보 데네디네 곰고르서 곰나디게 퇴 대야네야도 퇴네네 소소레 셈냐 장도르 딜바 곰장 데네 장네네 님보디 데에 담에 봐 도빅 로츠 디니보레서 하고도 다 띵에지 신에 아주 야네도 곰신에 줍데네 띵에지 미바제 제주도 이노 곰제 되는 거 공부했다 다제 퇴섬 곰숨세야디 데네지 녀모 방고레서 다 슝나로 퇴섬 곰숨세야디 기침무요 디나제 다 겨울치네 기디네 아주 최배치 위에 세배지네 안에 지 초어로 초 안에 샵된제 디섬기 아주 다다 주투 말에 제가 나고 롭종 제고레서 아니 롭종제 롭종제베는 아니 이제 하고 그래서 다디로 봐다 녀모바칸스 키고레 델레녀모칸스 띵어서 롭종제나 하고 그러면 롭종 마시나 하고 내려와 전에 사정제기디네 슝리아 안체니 리바 제바 제당 롭종제 낭배철이야 롭종제 어디 롭종제 어디 기침부레서 그디 나겸치기 가는 거래
In Buddhism, there's a great emphasis on this sequence of training: hearing or studying, reflecting, and meditating. This is taught by the Buddha and has been emphasized as the unmistaken method to transform ourselves. So here in our context, we need to hear about a variety of topics. In other words, receive teachings and read on those topics, gathering information. We need to hear about suffering, the various forms of suffering. So we come to understand not just the coarsest forms that are well known in society, but the subtler levels. And we need to understand the causes that lead to suffering. The wide variety of causes, in particular, the afflictions that lead to suffering. We then need to understand the variety of afflictions and their root cause, so we understand how afflictions arise, as well as their relationship to other consciousnesses and external objects. We also need to gather information on that this process can be brought to an end. It is not indefinite. It can be eradicated, it can be brought to a cessation. And then we need to understand how to do so, to bring an end to suffering, both on a temporary level as well as completely. How to do so? What are the variety of minds, of consciousnesses to develop to ease our suffering, as well as the one, namely wisdom, that will eradicate, bring an end to our suffering. And this accumulation of knowledge needs to be done extensively and repeatedly, and whilst doing so, not just merely passively taking in knowledge, but reflecting on this knowledge. Reflecting on it whilst receiving it, so if one's reading a book, to think about its meaning. To hearing a teaching, think about the meaning while hearing it. And then to go home and to continue to reflect, to contemplate on the meaning. So in our culture, this is what we call meditation, but in this context of these three trainings, it's referred to as reflection or contemplation. So we need to engage in continuous thinking about the teachings we are receiving, because what we are doing then is integrating that way of thinking within us. In other words, we're strengthening these consciousnesses within us. Then eventually, after extensive hearing and reflection on a particular topic, we are then ready to engage in meditation on it. So in this sequence of trainings, hearing, reflecting, meditation has a specific meaning. It means developing first calm abiding and then meditative insight on that particular topic, and then continuing to meditate on it with calm abiding and meditative insight, with the union of the two. This is the sequence we need to engage in. It's a sequence employed in the world as well. For example, to become qualified in a particular field so that one is suitable to practice, one studies extensively and while studying gains practical experience. The doctors we all from time to time need to visit, they thankfully have trained well like this. They endured perhaps many years of intensive study, and whilst they were studying, they were also reflecting on what they were learning, seeing how various topics tied one into the other, and thereby came to a deeper knowledge, and they gained practical experience too, whilst they were studying. Then eventually, without their professors being nearby, or a senior doctor next to them, they were let free to practice alone. And that then would be likened in this presentation to meditation. Prior to that, those many years of studying and reflecting is where we currently are on these topics. So if the doctor has trained well, she will practice in an unmistaken manner. She'll be ready to go into practice on her own. Same too with ourselves. We need to hear and reflect extensively on a wide variety of topics, coming to integrate them deep within us. And then when we're ready on a particular topic, we meditate on it through cultivating calm abiding and meditative insight on that topic. So what I've said here, you would have heard not just from me, but from other teachers, and certainly from His Holiness many times. We shouldn't just engage in what is more commonly understood as practice, pujas, and this kind of display of practice. We need to put our emphasis on the internal development through study and reflection. Study through hearing teachings and reading on teachings again and again, and thinking for ourselves. This is the meaning of reflection or contemplation. Thinking for ourselves about those teachings, coming to see how they are true, and applying them in our lives. That is the meaning of reflection, which is done together with study.
Dine zada dine ma jik top chimbo gyuna jishu nyamma so trewe 춘이 라서 제가 대신 한 내세는 지로 진당원수 교육로 다양한 저기 동방이 또 별로디 공부에나 지시 동방이 또 별로디야 검체 또 쳐줘도 네 된지 그런 누구 많이 두고 봐도 춘이래서 어디 나신 당한 저 미다바도 별로디 공부에나 딱받으면 따신데 봐 냠두고 매봐 차도 춘이래서 제가 디네산 진당원의 수비게 로디 검체 곱체 또 쳐셔야 줘도 참아디 또 쳐셔줘도 디 독초로 로셰디 아니 그 냠두고도 그 냠도 두고래 그 춘이래서 그 라신 두고래서 춘이래서 그다 춘이라서.
This paragraph concludes with, therefore, it is natural that as one becomes stronger, the other will become weaker. So as we develop the refuter, or the eradicator, or the harmer, in other words, in this context, the wisdom realizing emptiness, as this develops within us through hearing and reflecting and eventually meditation, it's the consciousness that has a directly contradictory manner of apprehension, namely the ignorance of self-grasping, will naturally become weaker. So this we need to understand well, because understanding it well will give us the enthusiasm to continue repeatedly to receive these teachings and reflect on them, and understand that this process naturally occurs.
나 이시간저 가르스네 진당우서 개비로디 고문 마도 디전 녀모바데 로록시데 메바스투 마레스 진당우서 개비로디 메나 아네 지시디 메바스투 마레라로 와다가서 잠바데 인조 겁네 딘신 메바스투 말 따스 메바스투 말가선 진당우서 개비로 마레스 지난 진당우서 개비로디 딱바지메 따지니 메바스 발라 진당우서 개비로디 마곰바네 잠바데 인조 겁베게 메바스투고 말가선 진당우서 개비로 마레스라로 와다 디지털로와 다 도바 칼리기리에서나 동예도 별로드나 가사 따바침비게 따진데다 가사 덴바모주바 또 별로인데 진당고스가와 레베스 디티와시기로와 거기 진당고스가 말어와 직디기 따바친 거를 직디 다음 동방이 또 걸어와 동방이 또 별로기 진당고스가와디 수레스네 딘진들에 마도 가사 덴바주베지 딘지데다 가사 동방이 또 별로인데 진당고스가와 책거래 마도 가사 동방이 또 별로디다 가사 따바침에 따진 이디 진당고스가와 책을 배스는 진당고스가와 책을 말와. 나 마차바이나 안 동방이도 별로도 겁나 된지 가사 따바침에 따진 매바서 두 말에 세 디올리기로 와가선 진당고스가와 말와 사지.
As I said previously, to eradicate a mind that causes harm, we need to develop its directly opposing mind, directly opposing in the sense of its manner of apprehension of that object being directly opposing. So therefore, as I mentioned, if we develop love and compassion, no matter what extent, it will not harm our ignorance grasping at permanence or our ignorance grasping at true existence, because those two consciousnesses are not directly opposing. So from this one can then have a doubt, thinking that, well, wisdom realizing emptiness is the directly contradictory consciousness to the ignorance of true grasping. So the one will eradicate the other. I understand, that's been said. But therefore it will follow that the wisdom realizing emptiness is not the directly opposing consciousness to the ignorance grasping at permanence. And therefore our cultivation of the wisdom realizing emptiness will not harm our ignorance grasping at an impermanent phenomenon as being permanent.
And the negative that Kansa Tompany to be loaded on Kansa Tabazimbe doesn't in Damusugo Mare. Maena Kansa Tompany to be loaded Combalatine, Kansa doesn't never suit waters. Carrigan never suit Lamna, Kansa doesn't the Tabas doesn't Cudi Caressine, Kansa Demba to be Dinzin de Latin Ligurua. Kansa Demba to be Dinzin de Latine, Kansa Tabas be doesn't Kigurua, Gurua. Chesa Tompany to Kansa Tompany to be loaded Dinzin de Nugurua. 제상 따진 귤이 누고래 귤이 내반상 그 귤이 매바서는 디 대고 차상 누고로 제네자 동방에 또 별로디기 대차 콩조 나자 따진 록시 차상 동방에 또 별로디 공부할 때 매바서 두고래 가르스네 디소야 귤 덴진이 매바서 고로 덴진이 누고래자 귤이 내데 대볼 누고래 배낭 저기 누구라고 전에 사번데 직 되어서 서울에서 매를 치게 답샤베네 제부디 야고 기도 말 봐. 제가 제부디 얘네 로마로 매도 시작에 민네 자와들이야 되어서 제샤베네 되네 매도를 감르고도 와. 제가 귤네 베게 제볼 누고 그래서 제가 가서 동방이 또 별로 디기 다진다 되차당 콩로라서 진당고 수가 말해대 동방이 공부에는 디차상 매바서 두고 그래서 가르쳐 고라서는 디차상 유디 덴진을 되는 리고래서 지난 덴진들 롱고 순이고 봐서 귤네 제볼 누고 그래서
For those who have such a doubt, don't worry, it's not the case. We cultivate in the wisdom realizing emptiness will eradicate, in fact, the ignorance grasping at permanence. And why so? The ignorance grasping at permanence comes from a cause, and that cause is the ignorance of true grasping. So by eradicating the cause, the ignorance of true grasping, it's the result, the ignorance grasping at permanence, will be eradicated. Just like, for example, if you have a beautiful flower, but you cut its root, that beautiful flower will wither and die. So similarly, to the extent that we develop the wisdom realizing emptiness, by it harming and eventually eradicating its contrary mind, the ignorance of self-grasping, all that would otherwise arise from the ignorance of self-grasping will initially be harmed. In other words, the strength will be weakened and eventually eradicated. So to the extent we develop wisdom and we harm the ignorance of self-grasping, all the afflictions, anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, resentment, as well as minds such as the ignorance grasping at permanence, all will be harmed, will be weakened, and eventually eradicated. So thank you. Then we'll conclude here for tonight. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask. Anisha?
I was just wondering, from an experiential point of view, what kind of characteristics you experience compared to having love and compassion with true grasping, without, like, what does it feel like to actually have love and compassion without true grasping?
So how would we experience love and compassion differently, whether we have or do not have true grasping? Yeah?
Experiential.
Okay. Okay.
잠재단 딘진념도 끼어도 내가래. 잠재기 용화 간슬로 그래서 수단 정신을 봐봐다. 소소 기버디게. 제다다가지 간절히 장슈쌤 잠바다 제와 공간 장슈쌤 공연 대다 딘진 기교배는 용화 가르리고 그래서 왜들이
용화 기켜봐 가리래. 니가 장세이래. 비축전에 쇼크.
아, 데데디네. 데데 용화 가르는 거라서네 유sem전되게 가서 또 동반이 마도 같이다. 동이 또 같이 제외나 동반이 또 한게 sem지 강사되게 바시에 sem젤미 배 잠재 고묘도 네 잠재 고묘도 qab려야 네 지금 잠재 공배 대단념도 강사되게 수 낭도 qab려 랑문이 주변한 거에네 어디 나와나시 요 말에 sem비게다 그 유마다 버려 sem비게 삼로디 리투고 그래. 다 동이 마동할라 sem젤 잠재 공바래 마도 공대 마도 낭도 랑문이 좀 나와나시 유마다 버려 sem비 삼로디 리투고 말에. 디니디 용화 켜봐시 모르거든요. 대용화 대지 등한 쪽에 장심디 용화 가려서 내가 저기 간에 봐시 돼야 말 호소속이 지그 가제 공부에 용화슈 쳇쳇 두고로와 지체 로할레 리기로와 그래서는 가제 공부에 공부 가제 쳇나 슈쳇요로와 공부 용화 쳇요로와다 그 잠바데 니지 공부 쉬로와 전슈 셈바 소소기부디기 공부하다 파바디기 공부 쳇베네 그 니버코란 치슈 망고 쉬어사로와 지자니자 그 용화 So if
we take, for example, two bodhisattvas, the one has a realization of emptiness, the other does not. So they both have love and compassion. So let's say they both have love and compassion of a similar level, but one has a realization of emptiness, the other doesn't. So on one hand, you'll say that the way they experience the object of their love and compassion is vastly different. The one will be the bodhisattva who has a realization of emptiness will realize that the suffering beings do not exist in the way they appear, but the way they appear is like an illusion, whereas the other bodhisattva will not have this understanding. And then, so that is a very clear difference. How their love and compassion, though, will differ. Well, this one cannot say particularly clearly from an experiential level without experiencing it. So the only way it can be expressed is that for a wholesome mind, there is a vast gradient from when they start to develop to the point of perfection, of Buddhahood. So for the bodhisattva has a realization of emptiness, by then they will most probably have developed far stronger love and compassion than the other bodhisattva. So therefore, due to the greater experience of meditation, of love and compassion, it will be much stronger. So that's about the best that can be said. Okay. Cameron?
Question, Greg. We're saying that ignorance cannot eradicate wisdom. What if we train in wisdom initially, if there is initially training in wisdom that is done and then it's stopped? The practitioner did not develop a valid cognizer, did not reach that point. And then the practitioner practiced trained in ignorance. Would that not eventually eradicate their original wisdom?
So we heard that ignorance cannot eradicate wisdom. So let's take someone who's developing wisdom realizing reality, but they don't get as far as developing a valid cognition, and then either they just stop, they lose interest, or they develop a wrong understanding, which will that wrong understanding surely will harm their, which is an ignorance, will harm their wisdom eventually. Okay.
Yeah, yes, left that. Casa. Yeah, that was a good. Like it is. The Angele, the young Tapatawal and Yamlen Che, and they got Chiki Yamlen the Kansam Chile, Meva Charo Shorva, the Meva Chadi, the Ji, Denzin Digi, Nubigi, Chagomar, Hassan, Sosugi, Yamlen Dumba de la Dumba. 냠네 제게 되발라도 거봐 되발라용도 되발이 슈체도 충조되데 고 냠네 제게 라도 거봐 마도 되지 덴진 그런 거 때문에 요스게 말와 너 책임도 와 덴진 거로 요요 말에 지난 덴진 되게 제거 때 되지 간주게 냠네 제게 양다 봤다와 장에 된바 dun여기 dun바게 다 dun여기도 다 dun여기 dun바들이야 바시로 샨다 제 dun바 dun여디 마 슈슈저도 한다와 냠는 제한테 발라로 디책을 듬버디 견책을 나 되네게 냠는 강점질이야 아주 록다 슈체 록다 깨려야 책을 제 록다 깨디 디기 데지 템버도 덴센티기 추네비 계시가 말해요 그런 그 록다 깨디 그런 게 삼르다하지 냠는 야다 뱉다와 제바 제한테 노트가 침바로 람노르 침바로 람 너는 저 제가 삼단다 저지 록다 계속마도 거의 람 딱다 줘와들라 근데 디마르와디 덴징이 네바스가 저 그런 람 냠는 제탄기 람갈 마소는 너는 송거와 마 록다 지나디 야다베 따와 제바 지디가로 록다 시키고로바 다 록다 깨다 가르시키고로서는 야나 덴바 두바레샤 셈베 삼르려고로와 지나디 제바 지당 토네 삼레요마도 덴바 두바디기 디슈케베 수케 말에 그런 야 제바 지난 디초를 봐줘샤로와 지난 초를 봐줘셔도 아니 동방이 초를 줘야지 람가디 바가로 보로와 지난 셰랍데 가로 보로와 지난디 삼만당의 초디 덴버주베지메 덴징디 초를 파줘샤라고 마도 덴징디기 수견제네 고 매바스가 가야 말아 대신 아주 동방이 또 불러서야 돼 디기 견제 동이 덴징 거를 매바스가 그러와 디난시 덴징디기 슈처제데 동방이도 셰랍 매바 차가 말해 동방이라 제바지디갑라 로록시 노르시네 덴징이 초를 파친소면서 아니 덴징이 용으로 셰랍 덴바주베 동방이 또 셰랍도 기토고 말아 다가제
Taking then these two people. So the first one who studied the correct view well, but before giving rise to a valid cognizer, loses aspiration, loses interest, and no longer pursues the receiving of teachings, the reflection on those teachings. So what has led to the change of behavior here, or you could perhaps say that has harmed the wisdom, but just that's my words, not Genla's, is not the ignorance of true grasping, but the loss of aspiration. So what has caused an obstacle to the development of the person is not the strength of their ignorance of true grasping, but their loss of aspiration. So their loss of interest in the topic. That has caused the obstacle rather than the ignorance of self-grasping. Okay? So it's a different consciousness. Similarly, with someone who is studying the correct view, and before giving rise to a valid cognizer develops a wrong consciousness. So this wrong consciousness, which would presumably be a belief in true existence. So now they, for example, but probably believe that phenomena exist by way of their own essence. This wrong consciousness serves as an obstacle to their development of a path, rather than their ignorance of self-grasping. So in both illustrations, the obstacle to the further development of the wisdom is not the ignorance of self-grasping, rather it's a loss of aspiration or their wrong consciousness.
다시 안쪽에 동방이 또 별로디 덴zel을 무슨 거래서 덴진디기 동방이 또 별로 무슨 거 말해 안에 동방이 또 배제바지 셔럽데 무슨 거 말해서 아주 무슨 놈에게 기셔와 다데디기 덴진의 유네 무슨 말하면 유네 되스 덴지 동방이 또 배제바지 삼노들이 되스 뇌그를 배스는 뇌그를 유네 무슨 뇌고 말해 유네 뇌고라 가서는 유네 뇌한테 가서는 콜람 로보선에게 노트 친애들 로디 다 자와 녀몽바로 친나 다 저거 가서는 그 마싱비 괜찮네 노트 쇼고로와 지금 마신바데 뭐뭐 말이 빠져라. 지금 디기 genje 노트 쇼야 쇼거래. 디기 gen에 노트 쇼로 디기 될 때네 아니 뭐디 제바지로디 매와 차로 걸어봐. 돈이도 불러디 뭐서 게임도 제거로. 지금 덴징이 뭐뭐 말이 빠디기 뭐서 돈바디도 불러라. 내가 말에 돈바니 제바지 불러라. 뭐서 누구 말데 귀인에 대해서 내 연구래디.
In the text, I want to bring out one word just to help with to clarify the answer. So it says here in the first line, a conceiver of inherent existence and a consciousness that is a directly contradictory manner of apprehension. Directly. So ignorance cannot directly harm wisdom, but it can indirectly harm wisdom. So this person who's studying well, but then comes to a wrong understanding, so now a wrong consciousness, this wrong consciousness harms them, harms their development, right? Stops their path, is an obstacle, so not harms, is an obstacle to the development of their wisdom. So this is now an ignorance, and so there's a different word for ignorance. This is one of an ignorance of confusion or not knowing. So not knowing reality, confused about reality. And this will then lead to ever more afflictions arising and taking the person off in a wrong direction. So therefore, ignorance does not directly harm wisdom, but it can indirectly harm wisdom. Or two contrary minds, yeah?
잠재 공제 잠바단 제와 공부했나 동의도 별로 들려고 누구 말해서 잠바다 제와 공부에 동의도 별로 방 된진을 내두고 말 된진 방도 말해 된진 무슨 누구 말해라 디나시 무슨 말에 배는 잠재 공부에 된진을 유인의 거 누구리 유인의 그래서 잠재 공부에 냠는 계주 개체 차는데 된 동마도 별로 깨야야 아니 계주 같이 채나 동마도 별로 깨와래 팽거로 봐 동마도 별로 팽반자 아니 딘실이야 귀네 내로 제거래 뭐서 내캔데 마이나 아디로 지지발다 지쳐서
This may make it clearer. So it was also said, love and compassion, no matter how much one develops it, it will not directly harm ignorance, because these two minds, love and compassion on the one hand and the ignorance of self-grasping, do not have a directly contradictory manner of apprehension. But love and compassion will indirectly harm ignorance. Not directly, for the reason given in the text, but indirectly harm ignorance. How so? As one is becoming more loving and compassionate, certainly in the way that the words are meant in Buddhism, you have equanimity towards all beings. You've understood the causes of their suffering, the causes of their happiness, and the yearning for all beings to experience only those causes of happiness, be freed of those causes of suffering. That way of thinking is related to wisdom. Certainly it leads to the accumulation of vast stores of merit, which aid the cultivation of wisdom. So in this way, the development of love and compassion will indirectly harm ignorance, but not directly. So let's leave it here for tonight. There'll be time for more questions tomorrow, but I want to say both questions were really very good, so thank you for that.